Our topic here is fulfilling the consumer market in extraordinary times. And our speaker here with us today is Mr. Abhik Gupta, Managing Partner of FT Consulting for Eastern Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And he is also former GM at Godrej Group. I'll tell you a little bit more about Godrej Group later, okay? So a little bit about him. He's based in Dubai, and he's an industry veteran with almost 30 years of marketing services, retail analytics, and general management experience. He has held leadership roles across Asia, Middle East, and Africa, including serving as Managing Director for East, West Africa, and Maghreb region for Nielsen, the marketing research consultancy. And as I mentioned earlier, he was formerly GM at Godrej Group, the Indian conglomerate and major FMCG manufacturer. And he has also experience working with Colgate-Palmolive in marketing. So over the last 18 years, he has led multiple teams in business establishment, turnaround, and growth, and advised clients at board levels on market trends, go-to-market strategies, business transformation, retailing and transformation, growth, and white space identification and innovation. Okay, so that's Abhik. Hi, Abhik.
Hey,
Thank
Jane,
you so
can you hear
much.
me? Can you hear
Sorry, say
me?
that again?
Can you hear me properly?
Yes, I can. Thank
All
you
right,
so much.
excellent,
Okay.
excellent, excellent.
So maybe to get us warmed up and give us a better feel of who you are and so forth. And I want to give you lob you a softball question, okay, just to get you going. Okay. So given your background and extensive range of experience, I feel like you're in the prime position to share very interesting insights on the operational and business implications of supply chain challenges in the FMCG sector. So before we get into it, can you share a bit about your ambit of responsibilities when you were still in the FMCG sector directly?
Well, I started my life more focused on the consumer. So I dealt more with data, with new product development, before I went to take on commercial responsibilities in marketing. So I used to run the P&L for detergents, in addition to buying media and looking after new product development for the group. So as part of the commercial responsibilities and the responsibility for the P&L, we were responsible for the brand, as it happened in the case contract manufacturing, and therefore a certain supply chain logistics, and we were part of the sales and operating team, as we are called. So essentially, I have looked at the full circle. So started with the consumer, looked at the manufacturing bit, and then obviously your final end goal is the consumer. So it's one full circle. So pretty much covered most of the ambit in my time. And then obviously, as I went on to consulting, it has been a lot about how does one reach the consumer. So a lot of the marketing, advertising, distribution, the end, the last mile, as we call it, right? And again, there is a massive amount of logistics and chain involved. I mean, half the times we've been speaking to supply chain saying your product's not there, or it's not reaching the right place, and how do you get there? All that kind of stuff, or where do you need
Even
to
more so now, right?
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
I'm sure you have a lot of stories to tell about that.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Yes.
Okay. So with that, let's talk about. Okay, you mentioned that your ambit of responsibility spans like from the front end, from consumers, and back down through the chain, to the manufacturer and the in betweens, the delivery and so forth. I want to maybe shift the conversation a little bit more to thinking about the consumer now, the differences. What are you observing over the last maybe few years in terms of demographics, the changing demand landscape, and what has been disrupted? That's what I'm building up to, because there was a point in time in the last few months when business as usual was disrupted, right? So what was disrupted? What has changed fundamentally?
With your permission, I'll want to use a couple of slides
Okay.
to make my point. It just helps to structure the thoughts a little better. That's right.
Okay.
Thank you. So, uh, look, I think the first thing that we have to understand is that the consumer is always changing, right? And I think the uniqueness of this current environment, and I am specifically referring to the COVID crisis, has actually accelerated certain changes or precipitated certain changes which we need to take cognizance of. In fact, one of my biggest advice to most of my clients, and indeed I have been advising a few FMCG clients of late, is to to recognize the fact that the world is not going to be the same anymore, and there's certain things which are changing forever, and therefore it is important for us to recognize those changes and prepare for the tomorrow while we are handling the current situation at hand, which I can tell you is not easy. So let me just highlight some of the changes that I see very important in the current in the FMCG context. The first is, consumer behaviors are changing forever. For example, I was privy to the plenary session. I heard quite a few minutes of and people talking about how working from home, and I saw a few questions saying, is it good? Is it bad? How do you, how do you ensure teamwork in these kind of circumstances? The fact of life is that you're working from home. Just think about it, and I'm trying to be as simplistic as possible. Imagine if you were in the office, you would walk down with your colleague, you will pick up a snack or a juice. Today you're working from home. It's not that snacking stops, but the context and the environment in which you're snacking, changes. If you look at one of the biggest benefactors of this crisis, it's probably digital media. If you look at Netflix, if you look at all these streaming channels, they've galloped in terms of their uptake. You as consumers, you are rethinking your priorities, and you're asking yourself the question: do I really need something? Do I not need something? Is it something that I can do about, or should I consume in different circumstances? So as there are behavioral changes, your demand pattern changes, and I think as consumer manufacturers, and the operating word is we are fast-moving consumer goods, we are focused on the consumer. We need to recognize how the circumstances are changing, and therefore what we need to how we need to cater to the consumer. Obviously, it varies by category. We are talking about a very, very large set of categories, so I'm being a little generalistic, and I hope that's pardonable. Then obviously, everyone's going through hard times, salary cuts, job losses, uncertainties. So, I was just reading a paper that in the US, the savings rate has gone up from 8% to about 13% or whatever. So people think they need to hold on to their cash much more. So obviously, your economic circumstances, the way you look at goods, the way you consume is changing, and obviously that has an impact on your your spending pattern. The third is that while there is this sort of gloom and doom about shops closing, retail outlets not being able to operate, lockdowns, etc., etc. There are also opportunities that are opening up, whether it is through e-commerce, through digital media, whether it is distribution, whether it is advertising, and as a business, therefore, and there are certain changes which are happening forever. Now, if we don't, as a business, recognize these changes, for example, the adoption of e-commerce in FMCGs has accelerated with this crisis. And in fact, I was just reading, an article day before where in the UK they're talking about, the 60 plus consumers who were earlier not so comfortable with e-commerce and the digital media. Today they are actually adopting it much more because they did not have a choice, and once you try it, you realize it's not so bad. So you learn it, and that change is pushing them towards, and they suddenly realize that this
So it's
is
like a
good.
silver lining of this pandemic, right? You force
Correct.
people to adopt things that they
Correct.
previously weren't receptive to.
Right, but think about it from the manufacturer or the supplier's point of view. If I don't recognize that this is a change forever, and if I don't start catering to the channel, I'm going to miss the boat, right? So, so that's very critical. Then, obviously, identifying white spaces. Again, there are certain types of categories. There are certain types of consumptions which are actually increasing. So you got to look at the opportunities. For example, if you are a soft drinks manufacturer and you see that there is snacking which is increasing, so people are consuming much more snacks, staying at home, and that seems to be the sort of conventional report wisdom as reports are coming in terms of category movements. So I need to identify white spaces and decide what new products I could launch. And then one of the biggest things I think that is happening is with this lockdown, it is pushing a lot of entrepreneurship, it's pushing a lot of decision making, and it's pushing a lot of innovation, which I must say the FMCG industry in some ways was slowing down or was slower prior to the crisis. So that's so much from the consumer side. In terms of supply chain, obviously, I mean, in fact, again, this is direct relevance to the earlier session where you're talking about the disruption of the supply chain. But then, as a manufacturer, you were supplying, you were sourcing your raw materials, your packaging material, et cetera, from certain locations where you had a certain set of criteria. All of a sudden, you realize with this crisis and with this pandemic, you're probably not so well prepared to deal with such an extreme situation. And then a lot of questions being asked about localization in terms of what is business continuity, how does one ensure business continuity should a crisis like this happen. Again, if I hear and heed the likes of the gurus like Bill Gates and a lot of business leaders who are saying, or rather thought leaders who are saying that this pandemic is not going to be the last. I mean, things like this could happen more so in the future. The question is my business ready for a business continuity plan? Do I have proximity? Do I have flexibility? Because you're adapting to changing environments, and therefore, while cost is an important criteria, or could have been the sole criteria before, here a lot of other criteria are slowly creeping in terms of your evaluation and preparing your partner. In fact, I'm going to probably talk about it later in the session as what are the sort of guidelines for supply chain. Then there is a massive, obviously, impact on finance, right? I mean, certain disruptions, maybe certain dips in income, then you're regaining lost ground. There are governments who are trying to support businesses. So interest rates are changing, financing, refinancing, cash availability. So and then you have to obviously try and make use of the best resources you have in order to fulfill your business plans and probably your revised plans. So that's very, very critical. And then external, I mean, if you look at what's happening in the larger world today, and there's a fair bit of politics involved, is that there are alliances being forged and reforged, right? There is in some ways some kind of a protectionist attitude, if I might use the word, where you're saying, how do I protect my domestic economies, my domestic companies? If they are suffering, how do governments sort of help them to sustain themselves? So there are you had these economic regions, you had these tax concessions, you had these trade alliances. They are changing, right? And you also need to therefore, and I'm talking about large FMCG companies, global FMCG companies who've got multiple manufacturing units based in different parts of the world from where they're sourcing. So obviously your sourcing patterns and your supply chain patterns need to sort of adapt to the new trade balances, right? And all of these are extremely critical for businesses. And to my mind, therefore, it is while business leaders are looking at the current environment and they have to go through this time, you need to also start looking at the future and see how do you sort of develop in this changed world. Does this sort of
Yeah, it does. Yeah,
yeah,
it sounds almost like while they're making this transition, right, from the old business as usual world, where things are a little more predictable, to a future that's a little more disruptive. Like they have to not just master this ability to pivot and change, but also be ready to keep on changing. You know,
right,
like right?
right,
It's a repeated process
yeah,
because they have to bear in mind that there may be future pandemics and disruptions and all that. They have to keep disrupting themselves. So
sure,
they need to have a model, a business model in place that's robust enough to handle all these ongoing changes. And I guess that means that people also needs to be ready in some kind of human capability development perspective. I don't know what that might mean. You know, some kind of mentality, you
yeah.
know, that can they are robust enough to deal with all these oncoming changes, and they have to literally um, be able and willing to go with the flow rather than,
Absolutely.
you know, like they were saying earlier in the plenary, one of the speakers was saying that one of the main challenges he faced is the mindset of the people.
Yep, yep,
Right?
yep.
So the mindset looks like it's set for disruption as well. It's not
Uh,
just like digital transformation or that. It's all in our heads as well.
I mean, look, we as human beings, we don't like change, right?
Yep.
And that there is a natural resistance to change. But I think what what this world is telling us with the pace of change is that the operating word is flexibility, you know, and that's what an adaptability. So that's what is going to ensure or I mean that's going to distinguish the successful organizations from the not so successful ones.
There's actually an interesting question in the Q&A. Someone's asking, what model can we start with, especially when cost efficiency and budgets are still in place? You know, given the need to worry about adapting and pivoting fast, and yet there are certain models in place that runs business as usual. What can we look towards in terms of like a new model for working in the new world?
Look, I don't think there is a one size fit all model or a solution for anyone. But what I would definitely urge is that, you know, when you had a costing model today here, I mean, in fact, let me give and probably take an example and explain. Uh, one of the fallouts of this crisis, for example, is that there are a lot of small players or players who are going out of business, right? Or there is reduced demand, or there are some companies who are suffering more than the others. Now there is incremental capacity which is available. Now, when I imagine if I were to be a manufacturer and I was taking the responsibility of manufacturing all the products on my own, essentially I was sourcing all the raw material, the entire risk was mine, right? Now if I see that there is in fact, look at the changes happening in two ways. One is there is spare capacity available, so I can probably not take so much of my risk, so I save my working capital and sort of go more into variable cost and actually outsource manufacturing and use this spare capacity available. The second advantage is that if you look at the pace of change that's happening, right? If you look at the pace of innovation, if innovation is expected to accelerate, am I going to keep changing my machinery every single year as changes happen? On the other hand, it may be better for me to sort of outsource and therefore at the right moment invest in machinery which is more futuristic and therefore sort of cushions me for some time to come. So, I mean, my advice would be the business model is not just about pure cost efficiency. In these circumstances, you need to build buffer, you need to look at accessibility and business continuity, and therefore you need to factor for it. You need to factor for how you need to reach the consumer more efficiently. So whether it is drone delivery, whether it is through e-commerce, whether it is through creatively through tie-ups, you know, these are things. This is how one needs to rework on the business model and manage the P&L and the cost essentials, so that obviously you don't want to lose out on profitability, but you need to rework on these essentials so that overall you are in a much more flexible and adaptable position than before.
Okay, so it sounds like the planning horizon has narrowed. Maybe the buffers have gone a little bigger. I have no idea. I'm not an expert in this area, but it sounds like lots of changes behind the scenes to make adjustments in view of this new way of thinking that you're suggesting. Right. So I'm wondering, moving on to a question that I wanted to ask: how does digitalization help? Then, I mean, it's notionally it sounds like it can help lots of businesses plan better and all that, but I think it calls for a kind of familiarity and understanding of what digitalization can do. It's not a panacea. It's not a magic pill, right?
Well, I think one of the speakers in the earlier session mentioned it very well, that you know, at the end of the day, what is important is the business model. I mean, the IT part comes in, right? And I think the same truth holds. I mean, if you just look at the focus of the industry, at the end of the day, we are trying to reach the consumer, right? We are trying to cater to the needs of the consumer. Now, if you look at technology and digitalization, in fact, one of the biggest questions that FMCG manufacturers are asking themselves today is, we've got these so-called well-formed channels of distribution, right? You had the distributor and you had the retailer, and therefore, you know, just like you're having your cup of tea, or, you know, so you went and sort of bought your tea from the supermarket, or there's someone else who bought it. The question as a manufacturer, as a brand owner, would be, how do I reach you directly, right? How can I reach you faster? How can I make sure that my channel of distribution is insured against any of these sort of fluctuations, right? So, you know, can I supply you through alternative means? Can you order through e-commerce so that I can deliver to your doorstep? Can I tie up with these delivery apps, for example, a Grab in Singapore, or a Talabat? I mean, can I tie up with them and you know, have a delivery system so that I can reach, so that I can bypass the system? So the digitization, so the ordering, fulfillment part of it, there is a massive amount of digitization, and as I said before, there is an acceleration. Now, if you look at the internal operations, the whole supply chain itself, I mean, just think, you are working from home, you've got factories based elsewhere, you've got suppliers, you've got multiple suppliers now, because you want to ensure business continuity. It's not a fixed process, it's a dynamic process. Demand is changing. So unless you integrate these systems and you have everyone online, you know, how do you ensure that, you know, the business process or the supply chain does not get disrupted, even in the face of this? So there is a big amount of digitization there. And then there is a third part, which is, how do I understand the consumer? I mean, my feedback mechanism, right? So if you look at people consuming social media, people are voicing, I mean, you as a consumer, your likes, dislikes, you're voicing them on consumer behavior. You know, you're voicing them on social media. You have, you know, if I want to understand who you are and what you do, I can actually look at their habits on social media, what movies they like, what they taste, what are their preferences. So when I have to even assess needs, there is a lot of artificial AI, machine learning, social listening, which comes in, which can serve as inputs to me as a sort of product creator. So actually, if you look at it, digitization has sort of multiple phases, and it impacts this industry, which is a fairly evolved industry, in multiple ways. One in how we reach the consumer, one in our own internal processing. The third is how do we the feedback mechanism, or how we get
So
to
it
it.
sounds this is an aspect of consumer behavior as well, right? That social media behaviors and how they direct their attention online to what they look for, or where they even look for shopping coupons or
Yeah,
offers.
yeah.
So right, so the eyeballs have also gradually over the years shifted, and given the pandemic now, a lot more have moved online,
Yep.
right? They start looking more on like the common the shopping platforms like Amazon and Lazada and so forth. So there had, I'm sure there's some shift in that direction as well, and that puts pressure on retailers or FMCG manufacturers to shift more marketing dollars in those directions as well, right?
In fact, in 2 points here. In fact, if you see, if you look at the sunrise sort of jobs, the one of the things that you will see is that almost every company is, even in this pandemic, is looking for user experience experts, okay,
Ah,
and user experience people, because everyone is trying to digitize, everyone is trying to enhance user experience, because that's the only way you can hold on to the consumer. So that, if you look at the shift in employment patterns, that's one big change that's happening, right? uh, and then the other part is, obviously, when you look at the sort of manufacturing and the analytics, how do I, without being intrusive, how can I know more about consumer behavior, right? And that is I think very critical
right.
in these. So you will see a lot of shifts even in the traditional sort of employment patterns, if I might say.
Yeah. I was thinking also, if, like you said, if everybody's going online, everybody's digitalizing in these ways, right? So it calls for maybe innovation in making yourself noticed.
Mm-hmm.
Your competition is that much more now. So
Mm-hmm.
you must do something different as well, and maybe that's where opportunity could come in.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of how you present yourself, how do you reach out to the consumer and rise above
Exactly.
the all the noise, right?
Exactly. And this is where my sort of submission to all of FMCG leaders is that you need to rethink strategy. The world is not going to be the same anymore, right?
Okay, I believe we have a second slide, if I'm not wrong.
That's right. I mean,
Um,
I think one of the things I just wanted to sort of point out, I mean, is for the FMCG industry, what should we expect? Or, I mean, I think I've touched upon quite a few of those points, but I just thought I would run through them. One is, you will have we should expect, obviously, depending on category. For essentials, maybe it's less. For luxuries or for personal care, maybe it's more. But certainly there will be market fluctuations. There will be decline. There will be subsequent growth. There will be supply issues, and therefore we need to be able to, our supply chain needs to be able to sort of adapt to these circumstances. If you look at very large countries, I mean, luckily enough, you are in a very urban environment in Singapore. But if you look at large countries, for example, if you look at India, if you look at Indonesia, a large population which used to be migrant laborers, or labor in the cities, or used to work in the cities, they've headed back home to their villages, or they are heading back home to the villages, because they see that's a sort of safer environment. What it basically means, there is a shift in demand patterns. So you need to adjust, and you need to adapt to these changing demand patterns. So there is going to be pressure on FMCGs. As it is, FMCG is a pretty mature industry, so there was pressure before. So it's something that we need. I think we need to be able to accept in a stride. And as I was saying, the pressure will be on innovation, and therefore finding the new sort of delta shifts. The second is the shift from traditional channels. If you see, a lot of small groceries, cash flow problems, they had to be closed down for some time. They could not sort of continue anymore, reduce working hours, lack of mobility, lack of working capital. So some have closed down. It's not that it's not going to come back. It's going to come back probably sooner than what we would expect. But the fact of life is that there is change happening. On the other hand, modern trade, e-commerce, modern trade has been doing well because it's more planned purchase, right? You're working from home, you're staying at home, the family is at home, so there's a lot of home consumption, and there is a lot of planned purchase taking place. So there would be probably a shakeout within the traditional trade and the organization in terms of size and location. We spoke about e-commerce before, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much. But again, this home versus indoors, what you would have probably gone out for a cup of tea with your colleague and a cup of coffee with your colleague. Today, you would probably feel safer consuming the same cup of coffee, but maybe chatting with your friend over Zoom or over a video call. So consumption is not changing, but consumption patterns are changing. But it will impact what you sell: home packs, bulk packs, individual packs, single packs, your pattern of consumption, and therefore that is something that manufacturers and product owners would have to understand. And then obviously we spoke about manufacturing and supply chain. I think I dwelt on it a little before in detail, but there will be changing in demand, contract manufacturing, there'll be M&A options. Could you buy out a smaller company to add manufacturing capability? So you would need to plan for sustainability, you would need to plan for flexibility, and you would need to plan for proximity so that you do not miss out on the market opportunity.
Right.
So,
and the you that you mentioned, I guess, is more like a two-pronged partnership perspective, right? It's not just the manufacturer, but also there's supply chain partners, distributors, and so forth. This conversation needs to happen.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, one of my biggest, in fact, I was reading a couple of articles, and again, one of the biggest things that they're saying is that you need to know your supplier much better. Who has the capability to adapt? Who has the capability to change? So actually, it is going to call for all the supply chain managers knowing their suppliers much better, and therefore be able to plan better for the future.
Plan and grow together, hopefully.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I'm afraid we're coming up to time. So thanks very much, Abik, for joining us today to share your perspectives. And for our audience, you may still have questions they are too shy to ask, but don't worry. You can still ask by joining ITAP Interchange Community Platform, where you can post your comments, questions, interact with other participants, and join in discussions. So once again, thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at the Interchange after this session and to having you join us in future episodes.